Brian Walker is the founder and former director of the Museum of Cartoon Art, where he worked for 18 years. Since 1984, he's been a part of the creative team that produces the comic strips Beetle Bailey and Hi and Lois. He has served as curator for 75 cartoon exhibitions, including the Sunday Funnies, which I remember well, 100 Years of Comics in American Life at the Barnum Museum in Bridgeport, Connecticut, 100 Years of American Comics at the Belgian Center for Comic Art in Brussels, Masters of American Comics at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, and George Harriman, Crazy Cat is Crazy Cat is Crazy Cat at the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid. Brian was editor-in-chief of Collector Showcase magazine from 1997 to 2000, and is the founder and current chairman of the Connecticut chapter of the National Cartoonist Society. He has written, edited, or contributed to 45 books on cartoon art, including The Definitive History, The Comics, The Complete Collection. Brian grew up in the cartoon business, the son of Beetle Bailey creator Mort Walker, is a longtime resident of Wilton, and perhaps will share some of how Wilton appears in some of the settings for Hi and Lois. He speaks to us today on A Life in Cartoons, growing up and working in the cartoon business. Please welcome Mr. Brian Walker.
Thanks, a nice introduction. I really don't have anything else to say now. It's nice to be here. I grew up in Greenwich in a home where cartoons were being produced on a daily basis, which was, I didn't realize until later, it was kind of an unusual childhood, having these cartoonists stop by the house and work with my dad. My dad's studio was up on the third floor of the house. We lived in Bellhaven. So, and I went to school in Greenwich. I graduated from Greenwich High School in 1970, the last class out of the old high school. So this is me in my picture of me in my studio in Norwalk. I'll tell you a little bit about that later. This is my father, Mort Walker, who was the creator of Beetle Bailey, in his Stanford studio. He passed away in 2018 at the age of 94. And he was still working and playing golf right up until the end, very active. Beetle Bailey started out as a college student when the strip began in 1950. I was born two years later in 1952. This is our Christmas card from 1952. My father had Beetle join the Army in 1951, and after the Korean War was over, he was concerned that the military theme would no longer be popular with readers. So he had Beetle return to civilian life and visit his sister Lois. And the readers demanded that Beetle go back to Camp Swampy with Sarge and the rest of them. And so he decided to start a second strip with an artist named Dick Brown. It was called Hi and Lois. It's a good trivia question if it ever comes up, that Lois is actually Beetle's sister. Hi and Lois started in 1954. The National Cartoonist Society began in 1946, and my father became a member in 1950. Here he is receiving the award as the Cartoonist of the Year for 1953, receiving it from Rube Goldberg, who you might recognize, and that's my mother, Jean, looking very glamorous. Our family continued to grow over the years until there were 7 of us. Some of you might have gone to school with some of them: Greg, Brian, Polly, Morgan, Margie, Neil, and Roger, who was born 2 years after this photo was taken for Jack and Jill magazine in 1966. I was 14 years old at the time. You can tell by the expression on my face that I was not excited to be featured in a kids magazine. I was afraid my friends in school would find out about it, and they did. On the right is one of our family Christmas cards from the 1960s. My father did a Christmas card every year. Jerry Dumas started working with my dad in 1956. He was also a longtime Greenwich resident. He lived on Crown Lane. And this is them at Mort's studio in Greenwich and Belhaven in 1961, where they launched another new comic strip called Sam Strip, which only lasted about a year and a half. Jerry worked with my dad until 2016, 60 years, and claimed that he and Mort never had a disagreement. I love this picture because the way that their drawing boards are facing each other so they could talk while they worked. And if anybody knew Jerry, he was a real talker. During their lunch hours, they would go down in the basement and have these incredibly competitive games of ping pong. And Jerry used to have to bring an extra shirt with him to work because he would be so soaked in sweat. And this is a Beetle Bailey episode from 1964 that gives you kind of an idea of what their games might have been like. The 1960s was described by Dick Brown as the golden age of cartooning in Connecticut. There were so many cartoonists that lived in Fairfield County, not only in Greenwich, but particularly in Westport. I just did an exhibit at the Westport Library about the Cartoonist of Connecticut. And Cullen Murphy, who also grew up in Greenwich, his father was John Cullen Murphy, who drew Prince Valiant, wrote a book called Cartoon County. And I suggest you read it if you want to learn about the Cartoonist of Connecticut. This picture was taken at the Millbrook Club in 1963. It was my father's 40th birthday. And I won't name all those cartoonists. They were all close friends of my father, and they all passed away. The Museum of Cartoon Art opened at the Mead Mansion in Greenwich on Field Point Road on August 11th, 1974. I had just graduated from college. I was painting houses. My father asked me to help clean the place up. And the next thing I knew, we were putting up exhibits. I worked there for 18 years. In 1977, we moved out of the Mead Mansion and purchased the Ward Castle, which is off of King Street, right on the border of Greenwich and Portchester, Rybrook, which is now called Rybrook. One visitor remarked that the castle looked like something out of a Charles Addams cartoon. Kurt Swan, Joe Kubert, my father, Bill Keene, Dick Brown, and Stan Drake, and Jack Murphy were among the cartoonists who came to support the museum's castle warming on November 12, 1977. We raised $35,000 that night, and this picture was in People magazine. In 1984, I got my first gag writing experience. That's what you call the ideas that you have for the comic strip are called gags, on a King Features strip starring Betty Boop and Felix the Cat. And soon my father had me writing for Beetle Bailey and High and Lois. Betty Boop and Felix lasted for about 4 years. And those are my brothers there, who also worked on the strip. In 1993, King Features decided that they would promote my brother Greg, Chance Brown, and I as the next generation, since we had officially taken over the High and Lois comic strip. Dick Brown had passed away, and Chance was his son. And this was all of our extended family. The cartoon group in Fairfield County was like a big extended family. Everybody knew everybody, played golf together, went to parties together. I grew up with a lot of sons, Tim Dumas and Cullen Murphy and Chance Brown, who are the sons of these cartoonists. For the 40th anniversary of High and Lois in 1994, we had Beetle go and visit his sister Lois, and they talked about what it was like growing up together. It's fun to kind of imagine the backstory of these characters to make it up. Chance Brown and I both lived in Wilton. I moved there in 1987, and Chance did this drawing, this painting of Wilton. It was the hometown of High and Lois, because we thought of High and Lois as Wilton residents. Unfortunately, Chance passed away about a year ago. This High and Lois Sunday page is from 1968, and it shows the Wilton train station. Dick Brown and his family used to live in Wilton for many years before moving to Florida in the 1980s. We have continued to feature local scenes of Wilton in High and Lois. Here you see Orham's Diner, which is on Route 7 in Norwalk. Rip Van Winkle Lanes, which I don't think is there anymore. Scoops Ice Cream, and other places like that. I've lived in the Silvermine neighborhood since 1987, and my studio was above the Silvermine Market for 25 years. If you look at that middle panel there, you can see me up in my studio working there. But I used to walk to the market on Sundays to pick up the newspaper, so this is a very autobiographical strip, saying hi to my neighbors. That was my original landlord behind the counter there, John Kurimbanis. This is the Silvermine Tavern, which is now known as Gray Barns, but the locals in Silvermine still refer to it as the Tavern. Every year, Santa Claus arrives at the tavern, and you leave presents for your kids in the morning, and then Santa hands them to the kids. You write their name on it. And one year, my daughter Sarah noticed that Santa had the same wrapping paper as Mommy did. And so, this is how these gags pretty much write themselves. I mean, I didn't really change it. It's just, I find it very suspicious that he uses the same wrapping paper as Mommy. I started the Connecticut chapter of the National Cartoonist Society in 1992, and for many years we had our meetings at the Cobb's Mill Inn, which I believe is still there but is not open anymore. We had our meetings in these various places like the Red Barn in Westport, the Silvermine Tavern, and the Cobb's Mill Inn. For some reason, they all ended up closing after we had our meetings there. We featured the Cobb's Mill in this High and Lois Sunday page from 2002, which he goes there for Father's Day and ends up picking up the tab, which is also autobiographical. This is the renovated Orham's Diner, which was moved when they expanded Route 7. And the family goes to Orham's Diner for Mother's Day in 2009. And Chance Brown actually went there and took photographs to make it look realistic. So it's fun to put the local places in the strip to see if anybody's paying attention, some of our local neighbors. Oh yeah, I saw that. The 50th anniversary of High and Lois was celebrated in 2004. In the 1990s and beyond, my father's staff continued to evolve. In the upper left is a typical photo of one of our gag conferences, we call it. We meet once a month. Everybody would bring in their gags, and we would read each other and critique them and grade them on the back. So that's myself and my father, Mort, and Jerry Dumas, and my brother, Greg. On the right is the High and Lois staff, which is Greg and I with Chance Brown. Lower left is the full staff, which includes my brother Neil in the green shirt and Bill Janoka on the right-hand side. And that guy on the right is Eric Reeves, who has illustrated High and Lois since 2009. He lives in Indiana. The Museum of Cartoon Art moved out of Ward's Castle in 1992, and 4 years later, the International Museum of Cartoon Art opened in Boca Raton, Florida. My father raised over $6 million to build this building, but it ran into financial problems and closed in 2002. After the museum moved out of the castle, I started doing cartoon exhibits at other museums. The first major one was the Barnum Museum in Bridgeport in 1995. And I also curated a major show, Masters of American Comics, which opened at the Hammer Museum and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles in 2005. It traveled to Milwaukee, Newark, and New York. I also did many books about comics history, including this 2-volume history of the comics for Abrams in 2002 and 2004, and it was combined into a single volume in 2008. It's over 700 pages long. It took me about 5 years. I also did Doonesbury and the Art of Gary Trudeau for Yale University Press in 2010. I curated a Crazy Cat exhibit for the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid in 2017, and an exhibit called Masterpieces from the Museum of Cartoon Art at the Bruce Museum in 2019. Maybe some of you saw that. It was fun to kind of revisit the history of that. It was right after my father had passed away. The Museum of Cartoon Art donated its collection to the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum in 2008. I curated their opening exhibit in 2013 and have continued to do exhibits for them, including King of the Comics about the Hearst Corporation in 2014 and a Mad Magazine exhibit in 2018. This was a cartoon show that I did in 2021, it actually was postponed for the pandemic, about all the dog characters in the comics. You could see there Sandy from Orphan Annie, and Snoopy, and Grimmy, and Odie, and Dog, and Marmaduke, and all the rest of them. And just this past year, I did a major exhibition of Ernie Bushmiller's Nancy at the Billy Ireland, and that was quite an event. We had a thing called Nancy Fest, and we had guest speakers and a play, and it was quite a big success. The National Cartoonist Society presented me with a T-square for service to the profession at their annual awards dinner on September 7th, 2023. And it was fun to celebrate this honor with my family. That's my son David on the left, Abby, my wife, who is here, and my daughter Sarah. So I'm going to finish the presentation by showing you a 16-minute documentary film that my son David made, and it shows the process of how a single Beetle Bailey strip goes from the idea stage, the light bulb stage, all the way through to the printed comic strip in the newspaper.
So I've been in this space here for over 20 years. It's hard to believe. One of the challenges in writing for Beetle Bailey is the strip has been around for so long. And there are times when it just feels like there's just nothing that we haven't done before. There's nothing new. I mean, we've mined every little grain of sand in Camp Swampy for humor. It requires a lot of concentration. You almost have to put yourself in another place. It's kind of almost like daydreaming. It's like there's a closet, a dark closet, and you're reaching in with your hand, and you're groping around to try to find something to grab onto, and you pull it out and you go, oh, there's an idea. And you go in there again, and there's another object in the dark closet, and you pull it out, and there's another idea. But there's this fear, I think a lot of cartoonists have, that maybe someday that closet's going to be empty. There's nothing in it anymore.
He's a military hero of the nation, though he doesn't always follow regulations. At the sound of reveille,
I'm a morning person, usually 7:30 or 8. Have a cup of coffee, I read the New York Times, then I start writing in the pad. A lot of people think a cartoonist sits down, he writes an idea in the morning, and he draws it up at night. He does one strip a day or something. I don't know too many cartoonists that do that. You kind of work in batches. I find the best thing to do is just start writing, scribbling away, and not looking for that perfect gag. Going back and looking at the characters and what they were doing, in the past and other situations we put them in before, oftentimes will get me started in the right direction. So I'm looking in here and I'm seeing Sarge and Beetle playing ping pong, which is something that I don't think we've done that in quite a long time. I know my father and his assistant, Jerry Dumas, used to always play ping pong at lunch, so there used to be some great ping pong gags. Sarge is a very competitive guy, so I'm thinking about how can Beetle outwit Sarge at the ping pong table. So the two of them are at the ping pong table, and Beetle's just about to serve, and he says, "Here comes my patented sleeper shot." When you have characters like Beetle and Sarge, they've been around for so long, they have really sort of strong character traits. Of course, Beetle is famous for falling asleep, but even more so, he can put things to sleep just by touching them. He almost has superpowers. And so Beetle hits the ball over the net, and the ball doesn't bounce. It just stops and sits there. And Sarge is mad now. He says, "That's not fair." The long evolution of a strip day after day allows you to do that kind of character development where your readers, if they're reading it every day, really feel like they know these people. To me, growing up, I know these characters so well. I think of Beetle as my older brother. He went off to join the army when I was little, and the strip in some ways is like a letter home from Beetle every day. What's going on at Camp Swampy today, Beetle? So you kind of create this world that I think after a while the readers really think is real. I think that was one of the better ones.
Yeah, this one has some problems. This is a pure reject. I didn't get it. Boy, look at that line of minuses on this one. This got everything, every rejection. I don't think people are going to understand this.
Yeah, that was
Oh, that's a plus. I thought it was a minus. You don't make good pluses.
Yeah, you got to work on your pluses, Greg.
Boy, it's a minus for your pluses. I think you need up here that you say he's already lost weight, but, you know, he's eating. I think the first panel, I just can't seem to lose weight. Beatles says, are you trying? And he goes through all the things he's trying, and then this is why he doesn't lose weight. I like that one.
You know, I was noticing that back in the days when you used to play ping pong every day after lunch, there were lots of really great ping pong gags, particularly Sunday pages with a lot of action. I said, we haven't done a ping pong table in a long time.
Okay, so that represents our ping pong game today.
Yeah.
They go to sleep.
Right, the game is short. It's over quickly.
I want to know, where are the bologna sandwiches? You got to have bologna sandwiches if you're playing ping pong, right?
We've already eaten them.
And another good one. There's two good ones stuck together. We write over 125 gags a month, which is at least 4 times as much as we need. I'm going to sit down here and start the finished drawings. I do all the finished drawings in pencil, and then my son Greg does the ink work. And we've got quite a great system. It seems to be working. I put the lettering in first. You can be a good cartoonist and a bad writer, you'll never make it. But a good writer and a bad cartoonist often comes out on top. The good thing about cartooning is that nobody says what's good or bad. It's just a style of drawing that each one of us has. The greatest thing about my career is that I don't consider it work. It's fun. People say, well, you're 90 years old. Why don't you retire? I say, retire to what? I'm having a good time. On our lunch hour, we would always take a whole hour off, even though it only took us 15 minutes to eat a bologna sandwich, you know. Then we'd go down in the basement and play ping pong. And I'd come up afterwards, and they were so energetic, the way we played. Jerry sometimes would have to go home and take a shower afterwards. I fell in love with comic strips as a little boy, about 3 or 4 years old. My father used to read them to me. He'd say on Sunday morning, he'd say, go down and get the paper, Mort. I'll read you the comics. We'd get in bed, he'd put his arm around me. He started reading me the comics, and his favorite was Moon Mullins. And he laughed so hard that tears would come down his cheeks. And I'd sit there looking at him and thinking, what a nice thing to do for people. And I started selling cartoons when I was about 10 years old. Dropped out of school, they couldn't get me to go back. And there it is, all ready for Greg to ink.
You all done?
I am all done.
It's all in a day's work.
I'll take the artwork, line it up. I rule lines for the lettering, and the angles. 8, 4 is the middle. Get the lettering pen, still dipping pens in ink the old-fashioned way. This is very exciting. Maybe we'll be lucky and I'll splatter all over this and start swearing. I've got a circle template to get a perfect circle, like for a ball. Don't do that for the noses. Make sure the swoop is nice and swoopy. Growing up with Mort Walker as your father, he worked at home, had a home studio, so you're there with him a lot, and you just sort of pick that up. There's unspoken things, there's things you don't have to worry about, and we just sort of know about a lot of the things and things we want to do and where we want to take the strip. In Beetle, we've kind of established this style. One of the things that most people probably wouldn't think about are the balloons, and we like to have them nicely shaped and rounded. Dip the pen, some ink on it. And even as I'm doing this, I'll make some changes to the lines. As you do it in the starker black and white, you start to see things a little differently. The sound of the pen against the paper makes a little bit of a scratching sound. That's a sound that I remember so much from my childhood, and it was just like Dad's working, you know, I don't know, it was a comforting sound somehow. It's the sound of cartooning to me. Freckles. It's Beetle. People get familiar with the characters. They're easily identifiable. You know, Beetle's the lazy one, Sarge is the big tough guy. Anybody who follows the strip at all knows that. I think the familiarity is really important. I think that is one reason why it's lasted as long as it has. People come to know the characters and think of them as friends, as my father would say. Beetle is so, every line is sort of important. It's spare. Ink dries within a minute or two. Okay, a few little touches here to make sure the lines are connected. Ta-da, one finished strip.
I think that's really a sweet film. I get choked up every time I see it because, you know, because Mort and Jerry. I mean, it's kind of a moment in time that no longer exists anymore. I mean, for years, that's what we did. Every once a month, we met like that. And my son, David, lives in Boston. He's a very talented filmmaker. And, you know, it's kind of a tribute to his grandfather as well, so very sweet. So do we have any questions, or?
To what do you attribute the success of the Crazy Cat, which has become really kind of legendary, and Smiling Jack, who failed, basically? He hasn't survived.
It's hard to predict the legacy, you know, for strips that are long gone, and which ones are remembered and which ones are canonized in exhibitions and such. I'm very involved in terms of writing comic history and curating exhibits and dealing with those factors, really. Crazy Cat is hard to explain. Either you get it or you don't. You know, I curated this major Crazy Cat exhibit, as I said, at the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid, which is a major art museum. It's like where Picasso's Guernica is. So for me to see Picasso's Guernica and then down the hall is George Herriman's Crazy Cat was quite a thrill. And my father would say, I never got Crazy Cat. It never made any sense to me. You know, it's not funny. It doesn't have gags, you know. But I think there was something artistic or something, you know, ethereal about it that has captivated intellectuals for years. I mean, there was people that have written essays about it and tried to figure out what it all meant. Smiling Jack, I think, was a product of its time. You know, aviation was a new thing, and he was a pilot. And, you know, I don't think that the humor aged that well, you know, so I don't know. You know, to each his own. Some people have come up to me and they say, oh, this is my favorite comic strip is Garfield or something. And I go, really? You know? You know, this Ernie Bushmiller's Nancy phenomena is something that Ernie used to live in Stanford for many years. And everybody thought of Nancy as a strip for little kids and, you know, as even Bushmiller himself, for the gum chewers of the world. And now all these cartoon scholars and aficionados and college professors and underground cartoonists, just Ernie Bushmiller is their god. I mean, you know, he's like, it's the ultimate comic strip because it's so simple and basic. And this Nancy Fest that we had at the Billy Ireland was attended by over 300 people, and everybody, they're all rabid Nancy fans. So explain that.
Thanks for the memories. What
Yes.
a wonderful presentation. Thank
Yes.
you. I especially like David's focusing on the scritchy scratch of the pen nib.
Yeah.
That's really special. We made several trips to the museum when it was here locally. And two things that I really remember was one, the men's room, where all the cartoonists would write on the walls, but also the stained glass window that was the ceiling over
Right.
the staircase. Where is that stained glass piece now?
So when the museum moved to Florida, that was made by two cartoonists named Guy and Brad Gilchrist, who grew up upstate Connecticut. And for many years, they did the Muppets comic strip, and then Guy actually did the Nancy comic strip. But they actually handmade that stained glass. There was, in the castle, there used to be a stained glass window there that had broken, so they made that to fit that space. And in Florida, they actually built a case for it, and it was on the wall there with a light behind it. At the Billy Ireland now, I think that's basically in storage, but it's very, very delicate, you know. But the graffiti in the bathroom was a funny story because that happened somewhat spontaneously. We had, every Sunday was a celebrity guest cartoonist would come and talk. And one time we had Chuck Jones, who's the legendary Warner Brothers animator that did Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny and the Roadrunner. And after his talk, he went in the men's room and he came out with this mischievous smile on his face. And I looked in, and he'd drawn the Roadrunner running across the wall. I think he got up on the toilet and with a magic marker and just did it. We didn't ask him to do it or anything. And everybody said, that's pretty cool. So every time we'd have cartoonists, they'd get up, and there were some of them that were a little on the, it was after a cocktail party or something. I think Johnny Hart got up there and drew one of his characters urinating or something like that. And then we had a women's cartoonist exhibit there, and they said, how come there aren't any drawings in the women's room? So they started their own graffiti in the women's room.
Thank you for the presentation. I grew up in Washington, and the Washington Post carried both Beetle Bailey and High and Lois, and Gil Thorpe was my third favorite cartoon. Now, newspapers have largely gone online. Have cartoons gone online kind of following that trend? Because a lot of people just don't get print newspaper anymore.
Yeah. Well, I always tell people, Beetle Bailey and High and Lois are still in the Greenwich Time, the Stanford Advocate, the Norwalk Hour, the Connecticut Post. So King Features, which is the company that syndicates our strips, which is a Hearst company, has a website called Comics Kingdom. And you can get a subscription. It's a pretty modest fee. I don't know what it is, but and basically set up your own custom comic page. You could say, I want to read Zitz and Mutz and Beetle Bailey, and those will arrive in your email every morning, and they're in color, and it's a pretty nice service. We don't make a lot of money off of that. That's the only problem with this online stuff. You get a little piece of advertising once in a while, but it doesn't amount to very much. And the other major syndicate is Andrews McMeel Universal Press, and they own all the other comic strips like Doonesbury and For Better For Worse and Calvin and Hobbes and some of the other ones. So, and their site is called Go Comics. So you can read those comics online every day if you choose to.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You mentioned or talked about reaching in the closet or in the dark room and pulling a gag out. My question is, do you have a stash of gags somewhere that you didn't use yet, but they're always there if you need them?
Well, we take, like, from those one of the things, but this method that my father invented, the gags, everybody does on sheets of typing paper and pencil. It's a rough sketch. You don't, when you're a writer in comics, you don't sit at a typewriter, you draw it. And we would write quite a bit, at least twice as much as we would actually use for the newspaper. So he saved all those. So up in his barn attic in Stanford with thousands of gags. And he used to tell people, oh, we've got 10,000 gags up in there. And my brother and I said, well, then why do we have to keep writing them, But for one reason or another, we didn't use those. I mean, maybe it wasn't funny enough, or it didn't come across well, or whatever. The grading system at the gag conference is fairly simple. It's either a 1 or a 2. But within that, there are 1 minuses and 2 pluses and 86s and anything else that you would want to put on them. For many years, his writers, so he had a staff back in the 60s at its peak were a guy named Bud Jones and Bob Gustafson, who also lived in Greenwich, Jerry Dumas, and Frank Johnson all wrote gags. And sometimes you think of a gag and say, that's pretty funny, but they'll never print that in the newspaper. So you bring those in, you draw them up, you pass them around, and my father would say, yeah, he'd call them his censored gags. And his Swedish editor came one time and found a whole box of these things and said, can I print these over in Scandinavia? And they're very popular over there. They've done whole book collections, and some of them are pretty dirty, but they're funny.
Yeah, I have a question. having grown up in Philadelphia and having access to Beetle Bailey and High and Lois, how do newspapers decide over time that, yes, we want to have that comic strip, or we're done with that? How do they assess what their readers might enjoy or cease enjoying?
Yeah, it's not very scientific. You know, there's no Nielsen rating or anything like that. You know, it's sometimes they have polls. Sometimes if they try to drop a strip, they'll get a lot of protests. I think newspaper editors, you know, one time called the comics like the barnacle on the ship of journalism or something. They never really respected comics as much as they should have, because consistently it's one of the top things that people would read in the newspaper. And back in the old days, you mentioned Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. were two of the best regions for Beetle Bailey, because of Philadelphia has a big circulation. The Inquirer was one of Beetle's oldest clients, and they paid a lot of money to run Beetle Bailey there. In Washington, D.C., of course, with the military and everything, it was very popular down there. And I think that the editors don't really know. I mean, recently the Gannett newspapers, which is the largest chain in the country, sent around kind of guidelines for all their individual papers, and they put things in tiers, you know. And of course, Beetle was in the top tier, so it's sort of protected, you know. It's, you know, along with Blondie and Hagar and Family Circus and Garfield, but you know, I think High and Lois was a couple tiers down, and we actually lost about 115 papers from that. And it was sort of like, who made that decision? Probably some editorial board, maybe even some people that don't really care that much about comics. And that's kind of frustrating sometimes, you know, what they choose to run.
I always like to laugh, so those were comic strips that I read, and there were lots that I didn't read because they seemed too serious. And I'm wondering, Prince Valiant, one of my friends read it faithfully and would regale us with crossbows and things like that. How do newspapers decide they might run something like that? Because that's history, that's way back when, versus something that might be political or humorous, that can be followed, you know, more in a contemporary way.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, the comics page, you can look at it as kind of a three-ring circus. There's something for everybody there. Some people like the clowns, some people like the elephants. I think, you know, over the course of the history of comics, you know, most of them were, in the early days, like Buster Brown and Mutt and Jeff, and, you know, sort of these raw kind of slapstick stuff, people getting hit over the head with rolling pins and stuff like that. And then in the 1930s, somebody thought of doing continuing storylines. In fact, the storylines were there all along, but doing what you call adventure strips, like Flash Gordon, Prince Valiant, Dick Tracy, and those took off. That was kind of the golden age of adventure strips back then. But I think over the course, you know, post-war era, some of it was paper shortages in World War II. They started shrinking the size that they printed the comics. And those highly detailed strips were the ones that suffered the most. Because, you know, it's hard to read, you know, an illustrative strip when it's this big in the newspaper. And it was the strips like Peanuts, which could survive, you know, it's so simple that even if it's printed this big, you can still read it. And those are the strips that really took off in the 50s. That whole generation of cartoonists, my father's generation, they were all, you know, had grown up in the Depression, they'd been in World War II, and then after the war, they started working as gag cartoonists in New York City, selling to the Saturday Evening Post and to Collier's and This Week, and they had those little spot drawings like you see in the New Yorker today. But there were a lot of magazines like that, and you could actually have a career that way. But a lot of those guys, including Charles Schultz, Mort Walker, Johnny Hart, Bill Keane, Hank Ketchum, they adapted that magazine gag style into comic strips, and with very simple style, and those are the strips that became popular from the 50s onward. And then there are always exceptions, like, you know, my friend Gary Trudeau, who does a strip called Doonesbury, he was the first cartoonist of my generation, a baby boomer, to sell a major syndicated strip, and he just broke all the rules. I mean, he had characters sleeping together and smoking pot and protesting the war, and really changed the industry.
Hi, thank you for doing this great lecture. I didn't realize you had a recent exhibit in Westport. That sounds pretty interesting. Regret not going. I was just wondering who were some of the artists who were covered. It'd be interesting to hear which notable figures lived in the area. Thanks.
Well, if you want to hear my talk there, Westport Library has an online video archive. And in that library, they basically have a television studio. So it's the video that they made of my talk there was pretty sophisticated, you know, different angles and shots of the audience and stuff. So you can go to the westportlibrary.org or whatever and go to their video collection and see that. But yeah, I mean, artists like Stan Drake, who did the soap opera strip, The Heart of Juliet Jones, and he later did Blondie. Leonard Starr, who did On Stage, which was a showbiz story strip, and he went on to do the comic strip Annie, lived in Westport. John Prentice, who did Rip Kirby, which was a detective strip, lived there. So many, the original director of the Cartoon Museum, Jack Tippett and Bill Yates, and so many guys in that area, and not all Westport, some in Wilton, some in New Canaan. Chuck Saxon, who was a New Yorker cartoonist for many years, lived in New Canaan. Even further back, there was cartoonists like Helen Hokinson, who was in the New Yorker back in the 30s, lived in Wilton. I can't name them all. We'd be here another half an hour. But Westport has a collection of over close to 130 cartoons that they acquired back in the 60s and 70s. So all of the strips in the exhibit there were from the Westpac collection, it's called. A pretty small gallery there, but I hope some of you got to see the show at the Bruce Museum back in, it was 2018, I think. Because that was a really quite a nice show that they put on there.
I was curious about, first of all, thank you for this nice talk, but I was curious about the commercial cartoons. I remember there was a Peter Payne that pushed Bengay, and there was a Volta that pushed Rayovac batteries, and the famous one is, there's no character, but the one who kicked sand in the guy's face on the beach.
Oh, yeah.
For Charles Atlas.
Yeah.
Did the process for these work the same as this?
No, in fact, there used to be an advertising art agency called Johnstone and Cushing that started in the 30s, but it was particularly busy during the 40s and 50s. And they did ads for, in fact, Dick Brown when my father discovered Dick Brown, he was working for Johnstone and Cushing, and he did the Campbell Soup Kids. They would do in comic strip form sometimes, and he invented the Chiquita banana character that was a cartoon character. And a lot of these illustrative cartoonists that I just named, like Stan Drake, used to work there. And I can't tell you all the different ads that they did, but you know, there were actually specific ad agencies that would crank out cartoon-style ads.
Is it possible to use computer graphics to create cartoons, or do you still use pen and ink?
Both, actually. High and Lois, since Eric Reeves took over. Eric Reeves used to work for Jim Davis on Garfield, and he originally was hired as Chance Brown's assistant, but has since taken it over. Does the entire strip on a Wacom tablet with Photoshop and a computer stylus. It does all the coloring. Everything is digital, so there aren't any original pen and ink strips anymore. But Beetle is still being done by my brother Neil, who lives in Coscob. He does the pencil work on the finished strips, and my brother Greg, who lives in Stamford, does the inking and the lettering. And we all write. We all come up with ideas for the strip.
Did Andy Warhol ever do cartoons?
I don't know. I think Picasso did some. I don't know if Andy Warhol ever did any cartoon. He probably did. I'm not sure. There's a funny story, Roy Lichtenstein, that did those pop art paintings that were basically blown up comic book, mostly comic book art, you know, the romance stuff and the planes rat-a-tat-tatting and stuff. And back in the 60s, his career Lichtenstein's career took off, and we were selling these paintings for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the National Cartoon Society invited him to speak at one of their meetings in New York City. And they were really ready to roast this guy because he was stealing their stuff and making, and some of the comic book artists that he was ripping off were making like $50 a page or something like that for their work. So he shows up at this meeting, and he was very self-effacing, and he said, I don't know, you know, I was like any other starving artist. I was trying to make a living. I was looking for something I could sell, and I did one of this painting with Mickey Mouse in it, and somebody said, hey, that's pretty cool. So I did another one, and here I am, you know, and it's just, you know, I wasn't my plan to begin with. And he was such a nice guy that they all ended up with their arms around him and buying him drinks and everything like that. So, you know, it's interesting how comic art is sort of leaked into the world of fine art to some degree. What's that? Yeah, yeah. Well, I do think there is a lot of discussion about our comics art, you know, and for instance, the Europeans have they don't even ask that question, you know. The exhibit that I did at the Reina Sofia, it was the idea of the director of the museum. It's just, of course, Crazy Cat is art. It's not the same as the paintings or photographs or sculpture or other types of art, but it's its own unique art form that deserves just as much respect. And, you know, I've spent, since I started working at the museum in 1974, all these years trying to get that message across. I think slowly but surely it's getting the recognition that it deserves.
Great. This was just great. Thank you so much for
Yeah.